March 16, 37 CE. Thunder rolled across Rome as Senator Lucius Marcus stood frozen in a palace corridor, torch trembling in his hand. The marble walls seemed to pulse with sounds he wished he could unhear, cries that made his stomach turn and his breath catch in his throat. When he tried to look away, to spare himself the weight of what was happening beyond that heavy door, the guard spoke with chilling calm. "Hold it steady, Senator. The Emperor demands proper light." Behind that door was not a council meeting or a feast. Behind that door a 14-year-old girl was being destroyed, while her father held a torch that illuminated her suffering. This was not myth. This was not exaggeration whispered by enemies of Rome. This was documented history, recorded in ledgers that still exist today. Cold administrative records that catalogue the systematic destruction of innocents under the reign of Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the emperor Rome knew as Caligula. When news of Emperor Tiberius's death spread through Rome in March of 37 CE, the city erupted in celebration. For 23 years, Romans had lived under the shadow of paranoia, endless treason trials, and a ruler whose cruelty had become legendary. The Senate was exhausted. The people were broken. Everyone longed for renewal, for hope, for a leader who might restore dignity to the empire. That hope arrived in the form of a young man whose very name carried promise. Caligula, meaning little boots, had earned his nickname as a child following his beloved father, the general Germanicus, through military camps. He was the grandson of Augustus, raised among soldiers rather than in gilded isolation. And when he entered Rome as emperor, the city wept with relief. Finally, they believed Rome had found a ruler with both strength and humanity. The first months seemed to prove them right. Caligula cut oppressive taxes, distributed bonuses to the legions, and staged spectacular games that kept the masses entertained for weeks. Senators who had cowered under Tiberius now smiled cautiously, whispering that perhaps they had been delivered from darkness. Altars smoked with grateful sacrifices. Families prayed in thanksgiving. In every corner of the empire, people dared to believe that a new golden age had begun. But beneath the surface, something was already rotting. It started small, easy to dismiss. A servant girl vanished from the palace kitchens. Officials claimed she had fled in fear of punishment, but her body surfaced days later in the Tiber River, mutilated beyond recognition. Then 2 more slaves disappeared, a boy of 15 and a girl of 17. Their corpses drifted downstream, faces frozen in expressions of agony that haunted the guards who pulled them from the water. The palace said nothing. The emperor continued to smile in public, and Rome, desperate to believe in its new savior, chose to ignore the whispers. The turning point came in October of 37 CE, just 6 months into his reign. Caligula fell violently ill, his body racked with fever, convulsing between consciousness and delirium. All of Rome held its breath. Priests filled temples with desperate sacrifices. Citizens who had cursed the gods now begged them to spare their young emperor. Even hardened soldiers found themselves whispering prayers to Mars and Jupiter. When Caligula finally rose from his sickbed, pale but alive, the city exploded with joy. But those closest to him swore that something fundamental had changed. The man who stood up from that bed was not the same person who had fallen into it. The fever had burned away something essential inside him, leaving behind a hollow certainty that he was no longer bound by human limitations. He had touched death and returned untouchable. From that moment forward, Caligula saw himself not as a mortal ruler, subject to laws and morality, but as a living god, answerable to no one. At first, the changes were subtle enough to rationalize. Wives of senators received private invitations to dine with the emperor, summons they could not refuse without risking their husbands' positions. Noble-born boys were offered the honor of palace service, only to discover that honor meant being dressed in silk and rouge, paraded as living ornaments for the emperor's amusement. Still, Rome looked away. He was young, they told themselves. Indulgence would pass with maturity. Time would steady him. But indulgence did not pass. It calcified into ritual. The palace guard was restructured. Soldiers chosen not for loyalty or skill, but for their willingness to participate in cruelty. A freedman named Helicon was elevated to master of pleasures, quickly learning that survival meant procuring whatever depravity Caligula demanded, no matter how obscene. By the summer of 38 CE, something new appeared in the imperial archives. Not a ledger for grain shipments or tax revenues, but a register of human beings. Daughters of senators, wives of equestrians, sons of prominent merchants. Each entry written with the same cold precision used for state resources. Only now the resources were people. One by one, Rome's citizens were catalogued, stripped of their names and reduced to inventory. The empire that had conquered the known world was now turning its machinery of domination inward, devouring its own children. If you're watching this and feeling that cold weight in your stomach, that's the recognition of how thin the line between civilization and barbarism truly is. These weren't monsters from myth. They were real people, trapped in a system that normalized the unthinkable. If this story matters to you, if you believe we need to remember these horrors so we never repeat them, please subscribe. This channel exists to shine light into history's darkest corners, because only by facing what humans are capable of can we guard against it happening again. What began as hidden cruelty behind locked doors metastasized into state machinery. By 39 CE, the transformation was complete. Depravity was no longer a private indulgence concealed from public view. It had become official policy, documented and administered with the same bureaucratic efficiency Rome used to manage its grain supply. Scribes filled scrolls with names that became numbers, ages that became categories, human beings that became inventory. In those lists, senators' daughters were stripped of identity and reduced to line items. Palace architects received orders to design rooms not for beauty or function, but for acoustics. Chambers that amplified screams so they would carry through adjoining halls, ensuring that those waiting their turn could not escape the sound of what awaited them. Torch brackets were installed at precise heights so witnesses would have no obstruction to their view. Caligula demanded not just victims but observers, understanding that degradation held no value unless it was seen, recorded, and shared. Guards drilled senators like soldiers, instructing them where to stand, how high to hold the flame, how long to remain motionless. A drooping arm, a whispered protest, and another daughter's name would be added to the ledger. The genius of Caligula's cruelty lay not merely in the destruction of bodies but in the systematic destruction of Rome's will to resist. By forcing the empire's most powerful men to stand complicit in the violation of their own families, he transformed potential rivals into prisoners, bound not with chains of iron but with shackles of shame and silence. The ledgers themselves, fragments of which survive in archives today, expose the chilling precision of this nightmare. They contain acquisition dates, compliance ratings, and classifications that read like trade accounts rather than records of human suffering. Victims were graded by utility, their worth calculated by beauty, age, or political leverage. The language deliberately stripped them of personhood, reducing them to commodities. One entry reads simply, Item 247, female, senatorial rank, restricted assignment. Behind that sterile phrase was a shattered life, a destroyed family, a father forced to illuminate his daughter's torment. This was Caligula's true innovation, turning atrocity into administration, transforming cruelty into a system, making evil efficient. Among all his outrages, none cut deeper into Rome's soul than his deliberate violation of his own blood. His obsession turned toward his sisters Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger, women who carried the bloodline of Augustus and should have embodied the untouchable dignity of imperial family. To defile strangers was tyranny. To defile one's own sisters before the assembled Senate was something far darker. It was spectacle designed not merely to gratify desire but to announce that nothing existed beyond his reach. The unveiling came at a banquet attended by 300 senators, priests, and foreign envoys. As golden lamps glowed and musicians attempted to mask the growing unease, the hall froze when Caligula drew his sister, Drusilla, into his arms before the assembly, shattering every law of Rome and every boundary carved by centuries of tradition. Then his voice rang out, calm and deliberate. My divine sisters, blessed by Jupiter himself to share my affection as Juno shares his. By invoking the incests of the gods, he forced the Senate into an impossible position. To object was treason. To applaud was to endorse blasphemy. And so they applauded, hollow claps echoing across marble, sealing their own daughters' fates with their silence. When Drusilla became pregnant, Caligula's madness reached its apex. Draped in purple and gold, he stood before the Senate and proclaimed that the child in her womb was no mortal life but the offspring of a god, destined to rule both heaven and earth. The Senate, whose voices had once shaped empires, bowed in obedience and decreed honors for an unborn child of incest, celebrated as divine miracle, but fate intervened. In June of 38 CE, Drusilla died suddenly. Some whispered of childbirth complications, others spoke of poison delivered by hands too weary of humiliation to endure further. The truth died with her. Yet her death did not soften Caligula, it shattered the last fragile boundary of his humanity. He proclaimed her a goddess, ordered temples built in her name, and commanded that oaths be sworn by her divinity. Rome was forced to worship the woman he had destroyed, enshrining victimhood itself as state religion. The bureaucracy that enabled these horrors operated with disturbing normalcy. In the eastern wing of the palace, beneath ceilings painted with scenes of goddesses and nymphs, stood what inscriptions called the Temple of Divine Service, a name that mocked religion itself. Behind its facade of altars and incense, the wives and daughters of senators were processed not as worshippers but as offerings. The machinery ran with the efficiency of a treasury office. Every act was logged, every body accounted for, every indignity copied in duplicate for the archives. Senators seeking imperial favor were issued ivory tokens marked with chamber numbers and appointment times. Transactions where their family's dignity was traded for political advantage. This was Caligula's insurance. The archives preserved proof of complicity, documents bearing the signatures and seals of Rome's most powerful men. Once a senator had participated, even through forced silence, he could never speak against the emperor again. His shame had been weaponized. The system even included what records called a breeding program, a nightmare that reduced human reproduction to industrial process. Physicians trained in Alexandria, men who had sworn oaths to heal, were ordered to examine women like livestock, measuring hips, charting fertility cycles, calculating genetic probabilities. Young women of senatorial class were assigned to soldiers, gladiators, even foreigners. Pairings chosen for strength, beauty, or exotic characteristics. These forced unions, conducted under the gaze of guards and scribes, were recorded with cold precision. Pregnancies were tracked obsessively, diets prescribed, movements restricted, births logged as inventory. The children were classified at birth and assigned futures: strong boys to military training, delicate boys to palace service, attractive girls reserved for temple rituals. Those deemed less valuable were condemned to labor. In this, Caligula achieved his darkest innovation, not just the corruption of family but the industrialization of lineage itself. Yet even this machinery of horror could not last forever. On January 24, 41 CE, in an underground passage beneath the palace, Caligula was cut down by members of his own Praetorian Guard. The official histories say he died instantly, but witnesses claimed his final moments were filled with the same terror he had inflicted on countless others. His wife and infant daughter were murdered hours later, their bodies thrown into the streets. The Senate initially celebrated, but their joy turned to ash when they realized how complicit they had become. The ledgers remained, the documents survived. Every senator who had held a torch, every official who had recorded a transaction, every witness who had stood in silence, all of them bore the stain of what they had allowed. Rome would eventually recover its glory under other emperors, but something fundamental had been broken during those 4 years. The empire had learned that civilization was not a permanent achievement but a fragile agreement, one that could be shattered by a single man given absolute power and freed from all accountability. The ledgers that recorded these horrors still exist in fragments today, preserved in museums and archives, testimony written in the dry language of bureaucracy to crimes that defied human comprehension. They remind us that the greatest evil is not committed by monsters from myth but by systems that normalize the unthinkable, by good people who choose silence over resistance, by societies that trade dignity for security. Caligula's reign was not an aberration. It was a warning, one that echoes across 2,000 years, asking us what we would do if faced with similar choices, whether we would hold the torch or extinguish it. What haunts you most about this story? Is it the systematic nature of the cruelty, or the complicity of those who witnessed it and said nothing? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. These conversations matter, because only by confronting what humanity is capable of can we guard against its return.